Daniel stood at the edge of his yard, staring in disbelief at the violation notice slapped on his front door. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was a personal attack. The HOA, under Karen's leadership, had singled him out, accusing him of breaking rules that didn't exist. His neighbors had ignored his pleas for help, too afraid to speak out against the iron-fisted authority of the association. Karen, smug and untouchable, had made it clear, "You're just one man. What can you do?" But Karen hadn't counted on one thing. Daniel had never been the type to back down. Beneath his frustrations simmered a quiet strength, a resolve that would soon set everything in motion. What Karen didn't know was that Daniel had a weapon far more powerful than any rulebook: the truth. The system had always been in her favor, but what happens when the one who is supposed to lose decides to fight back? The consequences would echo through the community, and Karen's reign would soon come to a crashing halt. But let's start at the beginning. Daniel Harper cherished the rhythm of his suburban mornings, sunlight spilling over the neatly trimmed lawns, the aroma of fresh coffee drifting from his kitchen, and the quiet hum of his peaceful neighborhood. But today, that peace shattered when he found an envelope on his doorstep. Unfolding the letter, Daniel's expression turned from calm to incredulous. The HOA accused him of violating community standards due to an unmowed lawn, slapping him with a $500 fine. He blinked, reading it again to be sure. His lawn was perfectly maintained, except for a small patch of flowers planted for his daughter, Emma. Stepping outside, Daniel surveyed his yard. It was impeccable compared to others on the street. His gaze shifted to Karen Wilkes's property. As HOA president, her yard was a glaring contradiction: overgrown grass, weeds, and tools scattered like forgotten relics. And she had the nerve to accuse him? Rachel appeared at the door, worry in her voice. "Everything okay?" "They fined us for the lawn," Daniel muttered, holding up the letter. "What? That's ridiculous." Rachel's disbelief mirrored his own. "I'm going to the HOA meeting," Daniel said, his jaw tightening. "This doesn't add up." At the meeting, Karen's condescending smile greeted him as he raised the issue. "My lawn is well kept," Daniel began, "and I'd like to know exactly what standard I've violated." Karen flipped through the bylaws with feigned patience. Section 3.5.2, proper landscaping. Your yard doesn't comply. Specifics? Daniel pushed. Because if mine doesn't, yours definitely doesn't. A ripple of whispers moved through the room. A few neighbors nodded in quiet agreement, but Karen dismissed him with a practiced smile. The decision is final. Frustrated, Daniel left the meeting, the subtle encouragement of his neighbors ringing in his ears. Something wasn't right with the HOA's operations. He didn't know how deep it went, but one thing was clear: he wasn't backing down. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the HOA bylaws spread out before him like a cryptic puzzle. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating his furrowed brow. He'd read through the pages twice, and still, the language felt deliberately vague. Was this intentional, or just poor drafting? He needed a second opinion. That's when Marcus, his retired lawyer neighbor, came to mind. Marcus was known for his sharp wit and an equally sharp eye for detail. Over a cup of coffee in Marcus's cozy, book-filled living room, Daniel laid out the issue. "These clauses," Marcus said, tapping the page with a gnarled finger, "are open to interpretation, and that's dangerous. But what really stands out is how inconsistently they're applied." Marcus leaned back, his chair creaking softly. "Tell me, Daniel, have you noticed Karen's yard lately? Looks like she's growing a jungle back there." Daniel nodded, frustration flickering across his face. "Exactly. And yet, she's the one enforcing these fines." With Marcus's guidance, Daniel began documenting everything. He took photos of Karen's property, the untrimmed hedges, the clutter, the weeds. He also reached out to neighbors who'd been fined, discovering a pattern. Fines were disproportionately given to those who'd questioned Karen's decisions in the past. At the next HOA meeting, Daniel presented his findings. The room, usually quiet and tense, buzzed with murmurs as he displayed the photos. "This," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm, "is Karen Wilkes's yard. By the HOA's own standards, this is a clear violation. So why hasn't she been fined?" Karen's smile faltered, and a hint of red crept up her neck. "I've been busy managing community affairs," she said dismissively, her tone sharp. "I don't have time to tend to every detail of my yard." Too busy? Marcus, seated near the back, spoke up. Or too busy using HOA funds for personal landscaping projects? The room fell silent. Karen's composure cracked for a brief moment before she laughed nervously. That's absurd, she said, waving it off. But Daniel saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. Later that evening, back at Marcus's house, the older man shared what he'd uncovered. Karen had authorized payments from HOA accounts for landscaping services that, as far as anyone could tell, had never been completed. Daniel, Marcus said gravely, this goes deeper than just fines. She's exploiting her position. The two men worked late into the night, piecing together more evidence. They interviewed neighbors, gathered old HOA records, and compiled a growing list of discrepancies. Daniel wasn't just fighting an unfair fine anymore. He was unraveling a web of corruption, and he wasn't going to stop until the truth came to light. Daniel's once quiet mornings now carried a new tension. As he stepped out onto his porch, a crisp sheet of paper caught his eye, fluttering slightly in the cool breeze. It was another notice from the HOA, citing his backyard fence as non-compliant with community standards. The timing couldn't have been more obvious. Karen was retaliating. The notices weren't the only sign of her resistance. Anonymous letters began appearing in his mailbox, laced with veiled threats. The words, though vague, left little doubt about their intent, scare him into submission. But Daniel wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight when he knew he was in the right. Rachel, his unwavering pillar of support, sat across from him at the kitchen table one evening, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She's just trying to intimidate you, she said softly, her tone firm yet calming, but people are starting to see the truth. That's what matters. It was Rachel who came up with the idea that turned the tide. Why not take this to social media? She suggested. If people hear the real story, they'll start to see what she's been doing. Daniel hesitated at first, but soon saw the potential. Within days, he set up a community group online, sharing photos, documents, and his own story. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in, neighbors recounting their experiences with Karen's unfair fines, their complaints that had gone unanswered, and their growing frustration with the HOA. The group became a movement. Residents who had once suffered in silence now felt empowered to speak up. The stories they shared painted a damning picture of Karen's leadership. Sensing her control slipping, Karen tried to shift the narrative. She organized a community event, complete with refreshments and cheerful banners, framing herself as a dedicated leader who only wanted the best for the neighborhood. At first, the crowd seemed receptive, but as Karen took the stage, the questions started coming. "What about your yard, Karen? Why hasn't that been addressed?" a voice called out from the back. "And where's the money for the landscaping projects?" another resident added, their tone sharp and direct. Karen's polished composure began to crack. Her usual charm fell flat as she stumbled through vague explanations about unforeseen challenges and miscommunications. The crowd, emboldened by Daniel's efforts, wasn't buying it. From the edge of the gathering, Daniel watched quietly. His heart swelled with a mixture of pride and determination. This was just the beginning. Karen was still standing, but her grip on the community was weakening, and Daniel knew that, with the truth on their side, the neighborhood had the strength to bring real change. The air in Daniel's home was heavy with anticipation. Marcus sat at the dining table, his laptop open to reveal a detailed timeline of Karen's questionable activities. The evidence was undeniable: invoices that didn't add up, financial reports with glaring inconsistencies, and testimony from neighbors who had been unjustly fined. Rachel stood nearby, her hands resting on Daniel's shoulders as he stared at the screen. "This is it," she said softly. "This is the proof we need." Daniel and Marcus worked late into the night, filing a formal complaint that detailed Karen's misuse of power. Every word was carefully chosen, every piece of evidence meticulously attached. The next morning, they submitted it to the HOA's oversight committee and shared it with local journalists. Within days, the neighborhood was abuzz. A local news station picked up the story, their reporter standing in front of the HOA office with a microphone in hand. "Allegations of financial misconduct and abuse of power have rocked this quiet community," she announced, as footage of Karen's overgrown yard and unused landscaping projects flashed on screen. The breaking point came at a community meeting called to address the allegations. The room was packed, a mixture of curiosity, frustration, and determination palpable in the air. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual confident demeanor replaced with visible unease. Daniel stood up, holding a folder of printed evidence. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. For too long, we've been subject to unfair treatment, unexplained fines, and mismanagement of our community funds. Tonight, we demand accountability. He handed out copies of the evidence to the board members, and the room erupted into murmurs as neighbors flipped through the pages. Marcus followed with a concise explanation of the financial discrepancies they'd uncovered, his legal expertise shining through. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice shaky. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, forcing a smile. "I've always acted in the best interest of the community." But the neighbors weren't buying it. One by one, they shared their own experiences, stories of unreturned emails, selective enforcement of rules, and unexplained charges. A woman near the back of the room stood up, her voice firm. "Karen, if you've been working so hard for this community, why does your yard look like a jungle? And where is the money for the projects you promised?" Karen's attempts to deflect were met with skepticism. The questions grew sharper, and her responses more evasive. The tipping point came when Daniel presented photographic evidence of Karen's property alongside records of her using HOA funds for personal expenses. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in outrage. The next day, the local TV crew aired the scandal, and the public pressure became too much for Karen to withstand. By the end of the week, she announced her resignation, her voice barely audible as she read from a prepared statement. The HOA board pledged immediate reforms, including a full financial audit and stricter oversight measures. For Daniel, the victory felt surreal. His fine was revoked, and Karen was ordered to repay the stolen funds and clean up her neglected property. As he stood on his porch watching neighbors wave and thank him for his efforts, he felt a deep sense of relief and pride. Justice had finally bloomed in their community, and with it came the promise of a brighter, more united future. The sun cast a warm glow over the neighborhood, its rays dancing across freshly mowed lawns and vibrant flower beds. The air, once tense with conflict, now carried a lightness, a sense of renewal. Months had passed since Karen's resignation, and the changes were undeniable. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Margaret, had a reputation for fairness and transparency. Under her leadership, the community found its footing again. Daniel stood in his backyard, gazing at the colorful patch of flowers Rachel had lovingly planted. Their petals swayed gently in the breeze, a vibrant testament to the battles fought and won. He bent down to pull a stray weed, his fingers brushing the soft soil. It felt symbolic, this act of maintaining a garden that had once been at the center of so much turmoil. The sound of children's laughter drew his attention. Across the street, neighbors gathered for a barbecue, the aroma of grilled vegetables and burgers wafting through the air. Rachel called from the porch, her voice bright. "Come on, everyone's waiting!" The barbecue was a celebration of unity and progress. Families mingled, sharing food and stories. Daniel was approached by a man he barely knew, his handshake firm and grateful. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "You stood up when no one else would. Because of you, this place feels like a real community again." Daniel nodded, his heart swelling with pride. It wasn't the recognition he had sought, but it felt good to know that his efforts had made a difference. As he moved through the crowd, more neighbors expressed their gratitude. Margaret, the new president, tapped a glass to get everyone's attention. "I just want to take a moment to thank Daniel for his courage and persistence. What he did wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And because of him, we're all standing here today, celebrating not just a victory, but a fresh start." Rachel beamed, her pride evident. She leaned over and whispered, "I told you your stubbornness would pay off." As the evening wore on, Daniel found himself reflecting on the journey. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, frustration, and fear. But through it all, he had held on to the belief that truth and resilience could prevail. The flowers in his yard were more than just plants. They were symbols of that belief, of the small yet significant triumphs that could spark real change. The gathering ended with sparklers lighting up the night, their golden trails weaving patterns in the dark. Daniel stood hand in hand with Rachel, watching the light show with a quiet smile. The moral of his story was clear. Even when weeds threaten the garden of fairness, persistence can help the flowers bloom again. And as he looked around at his community, stronger and more united than ever, he knew that this was just the beginning of something beautiful.